Greetings everyone, I'm Kevin and it's time for the first recommendations video for GlobetrotterAthon. So in these recommendation videos, I am going to go through the different continents one by one and give you some recommendations of books you can read for different countries. And then all of these books also fit multiple of the theme prompts. So as a repetition, I'm just going to go through a few things that is GlobetrotterAthon. So first of all, the book, in order to count a book for a specific country, it either has to be set in that country, the author has to be from that country, the culture depicted in the book has a connection to the country. At least one of the characters in the book comes from this country. And then for the starting book, the language is also an option. But those are the four main things. So author, setting, character, and culture. Those four things need to be in a book in order to, at least one of those things. Those are the criteria. And all of these books that I have selected to recommend today have at least one of those criteria fulfilled. And then we have the bonus prompts, that the book involves some kind of travel, that it's about a minority group. The cover includes all of the colors of the country's flag and it's translated. And then a quick rundown for the themes. The first theme is Team Car, and the first prompt is a city element on the cover. Then we have Journey, a book that is part of a series, a buddy read, so commute, and a crowded book, so a hyped book. Then we have Team Train. So for Train, you read a book that has a green cover, a nature word in the title, a book that you have wanted to read but you haven't gotten to yet, and it's a secondhand or borrowed book. And the third team is Team Fairy, and for Team Fairy you read a book with a blue cover or just blue on the cover, a water word in the title, a book that is slower or set close to water, and then a relaxing book. And the last team is Team Airplane, and so for Team Airplane you should read a book that has a white cover, it's a quick read, it's a 5-star prediction, and the last one is a book with mixed reviews. So now that you have all of that in mind, maybe you have already chosen a team. If you haven't, I will leave a link to all of the information down below as well as the sign-up sheet. So when you feel like you are prepared and you know what team you want to be part of, you can just go ahead and sign up. So now that we have gone through some of the team prompts and the bonus prompts and the criteria, this first recommendations video is going to be for science fiction and fantasy. So I asked on Twitter because the recommendation, it would be too much to go through all of these continents and books that you can read for these continents and not have them separated in some way. So I asked, do you want them separated by genre or age group? So I could do like fantasy, contemporary, historical fiction, you know, like genres, or I could do middle grade and children's, YA, new adult, you know, like that. But the majority said that they wanted genres. So this first video is going to be book recommendations based on science fiction and fantasy. So these are all going to be fantasy and sci-fi books. And I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order of continents. So the first continent is Africa. So the first book that I have to recommend is Daughters of Nori. This is a fantasy very much based on Nigeria and Nigerian kind of folklore mythology, kind of a pre-colonial Nigeria. This is the first book in a series. The second book is out now. So if you want to, maybe you have read this, then you know that the second book is out. So you could continue the series. I am planning to read the second book at some point. I just have to get my hands on it first. But I did really enjoy this. It has to do with these two girls who are twins, and they are the daughters of the earth goddess. And so the old gods are they're banished from the kingdoms. And we have this man who is not a very good man. He is put in power. And these two girls were divided at birth because this man is searching for twins and killing them. So being a twin is not a good thing. If you and another kid about your age look the same, it's not good, you're gonna get killed. So these two girls, they grow up not knowing the other one exists, and we get to follow this world, this kingdom, the culture and everything through their perspectives. And it's really, really fun to see the world and the cultures and these two girls and following them and their individual lives, what they go through and all of that. I find that very interesting. And you could read this for Nigeria, which also like Africa. And for Nigeria, the author is from Nigeria. The setting of the book is based on Nigeria, but you can also count it as England because the author is also English. The next book that we have is one that I think is the book that I am going to read myself for Africa, and it's XO or EXO. I don't know if it's XO or EXO that you should say it, but this is kind of like a superhero thing. This is set in Nigeria. It's again by a Nigerian author, and it's kind of futuristic sci-fi, and I think it looks absolutely fantastic. And as it is this kind of comic book graphic novel style, it's a little bit shorter to read, so it's a quicker read, which for me, as part of a Team Airplane, we have a prompt called quick read. So I do think that this is the book that I will be reading for Nigeria, and you can never have too many graphic novels on like recommendations. The next book is another book that I haven't read, but it's another option that I have, and interestingly enough, this is also Nigeria for Africa. I realized this after going through the books. I was like, wait, for Africa, most of my recommendations in science fiction and fantasy are Nigeria. I don't really know why, but that happened, so that's interesting. It's Son of the Storm. I've heard great things about this, and I am sure that you can count this not only as Nigeria, but you can also count it as something else, because this setting, the kingdoms in this book, is very much inspired by the like West Africa pre-colonialism. So if you want to, you don't have to count this only as Nigeria. I brought up Nigeria because the author is Nigerian, but it is based on West Africa. So if you want to go with another West African country for this book, that's fine. It's, as I said, like for fantasy and science fiction, it doesn't have to be specifically that place. If it's inspired by that place, you can count the country for it. And this just sounds really, really cool. I've heard a lot of great things about this as well. And I read another book that was pre-colonial Nigeria, but that was more of a historical fiction. But I really enjoyed the cultural aspect of the Daughters of Nori. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun as well. The next book is a little different from the other ones. It's still a fantasy, but it's more of a historical fantasy kind of, and it's Fire from Heaven, and this is a book that has to do with Alexander the Great. So it sounds very weird, why do I bring it up for Africa? Well, it's because the author is South African, so this book counts as both South Africa and Greece. And this is a book that I am planning to read for Greece for GlobetrotterAthon, so I'm also going to count South Africa for it. So 2 continents and 2 countries in one book, which is great. So for the books, you can count up to 2 countries and 2 continents. Unless you read a book set in a country and the setting in the country moves between 2 continents. So Russia, for example, is part of both Europe and Asia. The same goes with Turkey. Turkey is part of Asia and Europe. So if you read a book that is set in Russia and the setting is partly in the Europe side and partly in the Asian side, you can count Russia for 2 different continents. This also counts for if you read a book set in Hawaii. So for the country, it would be the US because Hawaii belongs to the US, but because of where Hawaii is on Earth, you can count a book set on Hawaii as North America for the US, as well as Oceania for where it's placed on the map. So I just wanted to bring that up as well. Then we move on to Asia, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. It's the biggest continent with the most amount of countries, so of course I have many books to talk about. The books are in no particular order. The first book is Girl, Serpent, Thorn. This was one of my favorite books last year, one of my favorite fantasy books last year. I love this. It's based on Persian mythology. Our author, Melissa Bashardoust, she is Iranian. She's Iranian American. You can count this book as Iran and the US. But this has to do with like thieves and Dachman, you know, like all of these beings from Persian mythology. And it was such a fun read to go for. Like, I love this book. It's also sapphic. We have this main character who is a princess, but no one knows she exists because she has a curse. So she can kill anyone by touching them, and that's not a good trait to have if you're a princess. And she goes into a lot of like lengths to rid herself of this curse, and it puts her in predicaments, and it's such a fun book. I really love this. I think this is one of my absolute favorite YA fantasy books of all time. I just absolutely adored it, and the cover is gorgeous as well, so that's another plus point. So, and as I said, you can count this for Iran, both for culture and where the setting is inspired from, but also from the author. And the US you get from the author. The next book is Gumia Wicked Fox. I didn't love this as much as the sequel, but in order to read the sequel, you have to read the first book. Dokepi Vicious Spirits, I love that book. But this is the first book. You have to read this before you read that one. And this is kind of like pitched as a great paranormal book to read if you enjoy K-drama. And I do say that's true. I am excited to reread this book. Like, you shouldn't read this line over here. Like, you could just hide it, because this line is what ruined the book for me, because I went into it with an expectation that didn't happen, because this is a spoiler for the end. How did it happen? Like, how did this line make it to the front cover? I don't understand. But it's kind of like a paranormal romance between a girl who is a gumyu. And if you don't know Korean mythology, gumyus are these women. I think only girls can be gumyus, and they have 9 tails. They're kind of like this mythological being. Really cool. I really love how Cat Show wrote this series. They are set in Korea, like all of the books, both books, there are only 2 books. Both books are set in Korea, and the characters are Korean. The Korean culture is all around, and it's such a fun story to read. The characters are also very like well done. I really love this duology. So this you can read for South Korea as well as for the US, because Cat Show is American and Korean, so that counts. The next book I have is a middle grade science fiction. It's Last Gamer Standing. This book came out last year. It's by Katie Zhao. This has to do with this game, and we have this girl who all around her people are just saying that girls can't be gamers, and you know, like, it's not for girls. Like, everyone who grew up in the 90s and in the early 2000s, you've heard that if you grew up as a girl, like, girls are so silly and weak, and you know, they can't play games and stuff. And apparently that also exists here, which is kind of sad. But I really enjoyed this. I thought it was very, you know, feminist in that way, that this girl keeps fighting for it, and she is the greatest player in this specific game, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. And for this book, you could read it for both China, because the main character is Chinese, and the author Katie Zhao is also Chinese, and for the US, because Chinese American, and the author is also Chinese American, and it's set in the US. The next book I want to talk about is another middle grade. This one blew my mind. This is one of the best middle grades I read last year, putting it out there, and it's The Serpent's Secret. This was so much fun. This was so much fun. This has a lot to do with like Indian mythology. Our main character, Kiran Mala, she's a princess, and she grew up in the US, and she always thought that her parents were being so silly and talking to her as if she was 9 years old, calling her a princess and calling her their princess and all of that. So she just thought that they were very annoying, very silly. But then one day on her birthday, which happens to be on Halloween, which is really cool, they disappear. And she finds out that she's actually an Indian princess. And she has these like sidekicks, these two guys coming to her house in the US saying like, we're gonna help you save your parents. And they bring her to India, like they go to India together trying to save her parents and fighting these evil spirits, and a lot of like mythology characters and beings. And it was just such a fun book. I love Kiranmala. I love following her. This was just such a fun book to read. Really, it was fun from start to finish. It was difficult to put this down. I love mythology, and I do really enjoy middle grade books as well. So this was a 5-star for me. And maybe if any of you enjoy mythology middle grades, you could pick this up. And as I said, this can go for India as well as the US. The next book I want to talk about is another fantasy, and it's These Violent Delights. I was a little bit, should I put this in fantasy and science fiction, or should I put it in historical? Then I was like, fantasy. And if you read this book, you understand why. But this is a Romeo and Juliet retelling. You can question how faithful it was to the original, but I love William Shakespeare's works. I really enjoy his plays, so I always, when I find out that there is a retelling, I want to pick it up and read it. What really intrigued me and what I really enjoyed with this is that it's set in 1920s Shanghai. I really enjoyed that whole setting, the atmosphere of that place, and we follow Juliet, who is Shanghainese, and the guy called Roma, he is Russian. And it's they are part of these rival gangs. They're not supposed to like each other very much, but of course they do. And there is this kind of paranormal plague going around. That's why I wanted to put it on as a fantasy recommendation and not as a historical fiction. But you can read this for China as well as for the US. Then we have Want by Cindy Pon, a science fiction book set in a futuristic Taipei, which is Taiwan. And this was a lot of fun. So this book has to do with in Taiwan at this time, there is like a caste system. So you are either very, very rich or very, very poor. You can't be in between. And if you are born in a rich group in that caste, you will continue in that caste, and the same if you are in the other one. So these two castes are called Mei and Yo, and Mei mean want, and it's the people that want, like the poor people want, because they don't have anything. And our main character, he is a Mei, and stuff happens in the beginning of the book that makes him want to a revenge plot. He and a few friends, they figure out a way to help other people like them in Taipei, because there is this really, really rich company who make these suits. Like the air isn't breathable, and so you have to wear this suit in order to live and be healthy. And this guy, the CEO of this company, he is distributing these suits, but they're not, accessible to everyone. And they have this revenge idea and plan to assassinate and infiltrate and stuff like that. So it was very interesting to read, and you can read this for Taiwan as well as the US. The next book I have is another one of my favorites, and it's Shatter Me. I adore this series. I plan on rereading it very soon, but this is a paranormal YA book series that follows a girl called Juliet, and she has the power to kill people by touching them. Very tragic. Very tragic. This book series is very dark. I'm gonna just give that, put that out there. It is very dark, so that everyone is aware of that. But this is essentially a paranormal, superhero-ish, also very romantic. The later books it sounds so weird. It's 6 books, technically now. It's 6 books. But for me, it's 3 books because it's the trilogy. But out of the first 3 books, the romance, it's beautiful. I love the romance in the series and the main trilogy. Really, really well done. And Tahereh Mafi is Iranian American, so you can count this book as for Iran and the US. The next book is one that I don't have physically, and it's The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I read this in January for the Poppy War read-along, and in March we are going to read the last book called The Burning God, I think is the name of that. Yeah, it should be. And this has to do with like this girl who comes from nothing and she makes it into a military school, and now she's really, really awesome. I don't want, like, I feel like there was so much happening in the first book that I can't say anything without spoiling the first book. But I think the hype and the reviews that this book has gotten can speak for itself. And you can read this book for both China as well as the US. The next book I want to talk about is my favorite middle grade science fiction book of 2021. And it's Wonderscape by Jennifer Bell. This was beautiful. This has to do with like these 3 kids who on their way to school go into this abandoned building because they hear a dog barking and they want to save this dog. But as they walk away with the dog, they end up on a giant ship in a glacier. And they're like, what happened? And they find out that they accidentally walked into a portal into the future, into a game. So they are now playing the Wonderscape game, which is in the year 2473, so a long way ahead in the future. And they have to work on all of these different kind of tasks and challenges and games within different worlds. And they have to accomplish all of this in order to find a person who can bring them back home. I love this. I really love this. You can read this both for Japan and for England. The author is English. The main setting of the beginning of the book before they enter the portal was in England, but one of our 3 main characters is Japanese, and a part of the setting is also based on Japan, or like Imperial Japan, which was really, really cool. I do recommend this to anyone wanting a kind of adventurous science fiction book in the future, who enjoys kind of an Indiana Jones thing, maybe like Jumanji, those kinds of, you know, game challenges things. I do recommend this. And the last few books that I want to talk about for Asia are books that I haven't read, but that I do consider reading for Asia for GlobetrotterAthon. The first book is Descendant of the Crane, which I think looks stunning. It's gorgeous. I've heard great things about this. I first heard about this from Joan He, the author, and I just was like, this sounds amazing. So this has a lot to do with Chinese mythology and culture, and it just sounds absolutely brilliant. I'm gonna read the synopsis for you. Tyrants cut out hearts. Rulers sacrifice their own. Princess Hasina of Yan has always been eager to shirk the responsibilities of the crown. When her beloved father is murdered, she's thrust into power, suddenly the queen of an unstable kingdom. Determined to find her father's killer, Hasina does something desperate. She enlists the aid of a soothsayer. In Yan, magic was outlawed centuries ago. This is a treasonous act, punishable by death. Using the information illicitly provided by the Sooth, and uncertain if she can trust even her family, Hasina turns to Akira, a brilliant investigator who is also a convicted criminal with secrets of his own. With the future of her kingdom at stake, can Hasina find justice for her father, or will the cost be too high? That's this book. You can read this book for China and the US. The next book is The Rise of Kiyashi. I am very much considering to read this as well for GlobetrotterAthon. Like, Avatar The Last Airbender was my childhood. My teenage years loved that series so much. And Kiyashi, I love Kiyashi as an avatar. She is absolutely fantastic. So here we have the first book in the Kiyashi duology. And like, I don't want to go into too much about this because you probably should have seen Avatar The Last Airbender before picking this book up. I don't think you can understand a lot of it. I haven't read this, but I assume it's good to have watched the show before picking this book up. But you can read this for China and for South Korea if you want to. You can also read it for the US. And another book that I am considering to read for the GlobetrotterAthon for Asia is 1001 Nights. This is kind of like a collection of Arabian folk stories, and I find that really interesting. It's not that long, and it's a lot of these fairy tales kind of, or mythological legends, which I think sounds really cool. And you can count this book as Lebanon and England. The author is Lebanese English. And then a few other mentions that I have heard other people enjoy, but I don't really know about them that much, but I wanted to bring them up in case they intrigue you. And those are An Ember in the Ashes, which you can read for Pakistan and the US. Jade City, and according to the author, the setting of this book is Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. So any of those countries you can count, definitely. And then also The Library of Fates, which I think sounds and looks really cool, and it has to do with Indian mythology. So you can read that book for India and the US. And then we move on to one of the shortest recommendation lists, which is The Arctic and Antarctica. The first book that I would recommend is The Polar Bear Explorers Club, which is very much what it sounds like. It's an explorer book. It's a middle grade book. I did really enjoy it. I did love the second book more. I think this got 4 stars. The second book got 5 stars, but this has to do like exploring an Arctic setting, which if you read this for Arctic and Antarctica, you can just write polar setting or North Pole or South Pole, doesn't matter. Like if they say in the book, we're going to the North Pole, you can just write North Pole as the country. You don't have to specify more than that. And it's because the continent Arctic/Antarctica aren't actually that many countries. It's more like a general, but I wanted that option to be if any of you wanted to read polar fantasies and you didn't know what can I count this as. The author is American, but I've already read a book by an American for America. So with this, you can count it as Arctic or Antarctica. And then we have one of my favorite YA fantasy books, which is Frostblood. And this as well, you can count this as polar setting as well. And I forgot to mention the author is English, so you can count this as England as well. And this author is American from the US. You can count this as Arctic setting, polar setting, as well as the US. But this has to do with Ruby, who is the Fireblood in a world of Frostbloods. And this is very much a polar setting. All around her, there are these, cold-hearted, reserved people, and Frosthearts or Frostbloods. And Frostbloods are kind of like, they have the same power as Elsa from Frozen, and they can, control colder elements a lot calmer. And Ruby is a Fireblood, so she is the opposite of that. So she is hot-blooded, and she can just rush into things, a hothead, very like that. And she gets a few problems in the book because of that, but this is a lot of fun, and she kind of gets grouped into this rebellion group who wants to be like down with the king, and she's all for that because the king is the reason her mom is dead. So she wants to do her revenge kind of thing with this rebellious group. And it's also a romance in this that I really loved. The entire trilogy is amazing. I love this trilogy so much. Just as with Shatter Me, I am planning to reread this very soon. I can't wait to reread it. But this you can read for Arctic setting, Arctic/Antarctica continent in the US. If you read it for Antarctica or Arctic, you can just, when you track the book, you can just write Arctic setting or polar fantasy or something like that. You don't have to specify the exact country. The next one is very similar to that, and it's Frostheart. This time, instead of like an American author, it's an English author, so you can count this as Arctic, polar setting, and England if you want to. I have only read 100 pages of this. I am reading it this February, so I am going to be finished with this before March. This, I should also say, is a middle grade. This follows a guy who has this singing ability, which is very frowned upon, and he sets off on this mission to find the truth about himself, and he goes with a girl and a Jedi. So I would do this so you see. These three are going to travel and kind of adventurous and figure things out, explore and stuff like that. So it sounds very, very fun. I did enjoy the 100 pages that I read of it, and I know that Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin adores this series. And the last book that I want to talk about is another book that I am, or the only book out of these that I am considering reading for Arctic and Antarctica, because I've already read the other ones. In Frostheart, I will be finished with in February, so before March when GlobetrotterAthon begins. But it's Below, and Below is set in Greenland, or a very like historical Greenland, and it has a lot to do with the Inuit culture and mythology. So it does sound really, really interesting. And so if you read this book and you want to track it, it's Arctic and Antarctica, as well as for country you can write Greenland if you want to, or polar setting, doesn't matter. And then we move on to Europe, and in this list I didn't include for England or Great Britain at all, because I think it's the easiest to find. If you want to read like a fantasy book from an English author or a British author, I think that's very easy to find. So that's why I didn't want to include that. Or I mean setting. I do have some English authors and we'll be talking about. The first book I wanted to mention is The Song of Achilles, which you can read for Greece as well as the US. The Greek GlobetrotterAthon is at the same time as GlobetrotterAthon, so I wanted to mention a few books that you could read for that as well. But this kind of follows the old epic poem by Homer that has to do with Achilles, and it's the Iliad. Greek mythology has a special place in my heart because I did study it, and I did write like an essay in university about the Iliad and the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. So it does have a special place in my heart to read this kind of story, but I know that not everyone loves this. Some hates one of the characters, some adores it, some cries about it, some don't, and it's a lot of like very mixed. But this follows the Iliad, is apart from the fact that it's from Patroclus's perspective, and I love how we follow these two boys as they grew up and their friendship and the relationship progressing and all of that. I thought it was really, really fun to go on that journey with them. Then we have another book for Greece, and it's 1,000 Ships. This book you can read for Greece as well as England, because the author is English but the setting and the story is Greek. This kind of follows the women's perspective on the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is what happened in the Song of Achilles, and this is the female's perspective. I have read it once, but I read it as an audiobook, and it confused me a lot because every perspective was the same narrator, so it wasn't really that easy for me to keep track who are we following currently. But I got it as a physical copy because I think I would enjoy it a lot more if I read it physically. So I might just read this GlobetrotterAthon as well, but I thought it was a lot of fun to get that perspective on the Trojan War, because when you talk about that, it's mostly the men in focus and the women are kind of like these trophies that you fight for and objects basically. So I thought this was very interesting to have. The next book is very close to home because you can read it for Sweden, Norway, Denmark or Iceland. So any Nordic country apart from Finland. Any Nordic country apart from Finland you can read it for. And it's They. And here we have the Swedish copy and here you have the English copy. So there is a little bit of a size difference, which I thought was kind of hilarious that there is this big size difference for a graphic novel. But this is the English copy and we're following They, this girl, and she comes, oh my god. This is the first time I read the names in English. I mean, most of them are the same. But this follows Vey, and she's from Jotunheim, and she is banished from Jotunheim. We don't know why in the beginning of the book. She ends up meeting people from Asgard, which is not very fun if you're from Jotunheim. And this has this kind of gladiator game at focus of it, which was really, really fun. If you're interested in the Oz of Faith, Norse mythology and stuff like that, and want to learn more about the perspectives, I think you would enjoy this. If you're a hardcore fan of what Marvel did with the old gods and the setting, you would probably not like this. But as someone who, like, I love mythology, so of course I love the old religion of my own country or my own culture. So like Norse mythology, or what I prefer, I use as a faith. I use the word for the religion because it is a religion in my opinion. It's not a mythology. So I usually say as a faith and not Norse mythology. But I really love how this depicted the old culture, even though it's definitely like not accurate in that way. But I love to see actual people from the culture write this kind of book about the culture, because I have such an issue reading like Viking fantasy books by non-Nordic people, because the way that they see us in our history and our culture is very tragic, because they don't know what happened when the Christians came and, you know, like all of that. So it's kind of weird to me. But I do recommend this if you want a very like short and beautiful graphic novel. And I should like give a trigger warning. There is nudity in this, which I did not expect going into it, but there's nudity in this graphic novel duology. There are 2 books. I really love them. I think I give both 5 stars. Adored it. But yes, you can read this for any Nordic country apart from Finland. Kind of funny. And then another book that I wanted to talk about that I don't have is The Bear and the Nightingale, which is set in Russia. So it's a fantasy book based on Russia, and you can read it for Russia as well as the US. The last book I want to talk about for Europe is The Final Sex. I love this. It's a science fiction book. We're following this girl who is Iranian and this boy who is Italian. So you can count it as Iran as well as Italy. And there is this kind of competition to become one of the final 6 to travel to Mars, because yeah, humans have pushed the limits of Earth until the point that it's barely habitable. You can barely live on Earth anymore. And so what you do is there is this program to send kids to Mars. These two, like this boy and this girl, they fight to make it to Mars, and things happen. There's another thing that they aren't supposed to know, but that they figure out, and there is more to this program than it seems. I thought this was a lot of fun. Yeah, I can't wait to read the second book. I have the second book here on my TBR shelf, and I would really love to read that book. But this you can read for Iran, the US, or Italy. Then we move on to North America, and as I said, I'm not going to have a lot of books on North America to talk about because it's the easiest to find. Like if you hear about a fantasy book, it's usually American from the US specifically. The one book that I have that I own that I would recommend is Percy Jackson, because you can read it both for the US as well as for Greek, so it fits for both. And it has to do a lot with Greek mythology. It's a middle grade. It has great disability representation for ADHD as well as dyslexia, and it's very sarcastic, very, very fun. And it's just a very quick read and very fun read if you enjoy middle grades and mythology. And then I wanted to recommend Alice Payne Arrives, which is a Canadian story. It's set in different countries, but I can't tell you all of the countries that it's set in because there are just too much to keep track of in my head. But you can read this book for Canada and more countries than that. It has to do with time travel. So if you enjoy, like me, the show Timeless, you would really enjoy this book. It's absolutely great. Like, I love, it's a very short book, first of all, but it's great when it comes to like the whole time travel thing. And it also is kind of like in Timeless that there is a bigger plot than they first think. It's just a lot of fun. A lot of fun. And then I also wanted to mention a few books for Mexico that you could read. So first of all, we have the author Silvia Moreno Garcia, who writes kind of magical realism, horror, gore, fantasy, kind of like that. And she is Mexican and American, so you can read any of her books for Mexico as well as the US. And then I also wanted to recommend another middle grade mythology book, which is Stormrunner, that you can also read for Mexico and the US. And this book has to do with Mayan mythology, which I think sounds incredible. And this is definitely a book that I am considering reading for Mexico. I think like Mayan mythology is such an interesting mythology and it really intrigues me. I think it sounds really, really fun. And then we move on to Oceania. And I am yeah, we're going to end this recommendation list with the 3 continents I have the least books for. So North America, not a lot of books. And now Oceania. The first book that I can recommend for Oceania is Captive Prince. I know that a lot of people disagree on this because some people find it bad and some people love it. I loved it. I love the series. This is not my favorite book in the series. I prefer the second and the last book. It's a trilogy. The author is Australian, so C.S. Packard is Australian, so it counts for Australia in that way. You can also count it for France and Greece, because kingdoms in this book are based on France and Greece, so that counts. This book is about this guy called Damon, who is the crown prince of Achilles, and he is kidnapped and taken as a sex slave to Veer, the capital of Veer. He goes through kind of abuse. You can definitely call it abuse during his time in Veer, but then he forms this kind of allyship, or what is called alliance. He forms this alliance with the crown prince of Veer called Prince Laurent, and I enjoyed the progression of these 2 characters from the first to the second to the third book. Do I think that it's unproblematic? No. I think this series is definitely problematic. I know I mentioned it in another video that I do love this series, but if you read it and you think that the romance in this is something to strive for, no, just no. It's a beautiful story. I love the fantasy, the world in this series, but I would never urge anyone to want the kind of romance in this, because it's a dark romance fantasy in that way. It's not a fairy tale, cutesy romance. I just want to say that that's the main reason that it's gotten a lot of negativity from reviewers and stuff. I personally adore this series and I plan on rereading it as soon as I can. But this is another book that I would recommend as a fantasy for Oceania. This is the only fantasy book that I've read from an Australian author. Yeah, so... And the last book that I wanted to bring up for Oceania is a book that I haven't read, but I've heard a lot of great things about, and I am personally really excited to read this book. And it's Gideon the Ninth. The author is from New Zealand, so you can definitely read it from New Zealand. And I did not know this. I had to Google fantasy by New Zealandese authors, and this came up, and apparently she's from New Zealand, and I was like, wow, now I can read this book for Oceania and for New Zealand, so that's great. But this, I've heard a lot of great things about this book. I don't really know what it's about, but you probably recognize the cover. It looks amazing, right? And then we're on to the last continent, which is South America. And I only have 2 books on this, and 2 books I have never read. Yeah. But both of them are magical realism books, because that is something that is very Latin American and very South American. They have this literary culture of writing magical realism, which I think is really cool. So 2 authors that I do recommend because I've heard great things about them, and I do plan on reading from both in the future. Isabel Allende, who you can read any book from hers and count as Chile and the US because she's from Chile. And the other one is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he is Colombian. So those 2 authors you can read. Magical realism I counts as fantasy and sci-fi. And genre doesn't really matter. It's country and continents that matters. Well, that was it for the recommendations for fantasy and science fiction. I hope you enjoyed this. Next week, I'm going to do another recommendation video for the 7 continents, but another genre. I will focus on a different genre next time. I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you next time. If you want to sign up for the GlobetrotterAthon, you have the sign-up sheet down below, as well as every single little piece of information you could be interested in. And I will see you next time. Good reading. Bye.